I was sweeping frost from the porch when I saw it. Fresh chalk letters on the inside of the barn wall, high up where no wind could reach. My dead son's handwriting, clear as the day he left for the front. Mama, I'm still here. In the winter of 1946, I lived alone in the small white house at the end of County Road 9, the one with the sagging barn and the well that had gone dry the year my boy marched away. Folks in town had long stopped speaking his name out loud. They only offered the same soft pity whenever I passed. 5 years of silence, 5 years of keeping his room exactly as he left it, and 5 years of waking to an empty dawn. Until that morning, when the barn boards carried his voice back to me. The wind had quieted just moments before, leaving the world unbearably still, as though the night itself had paused to watch me sweep the thin crust of snow from the barn's threshold. The lantern hanging by the door flickered softly, its light trembling across the old boards like a heartbeat against ribcage walls. I bent to clear another line of frost, numb fingers wrapped around the worn handle of the broom, when something caught the glow. Sharp, white strokes etched onto the wood. I straightened slowly, breath misting the air, lantern light widening over the words. My name, written in a hand I knew better than my own. The broom slipped from my grasp and landed silently in the snow. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The night pressed close, heavy and watchful, the barn looming like a shadowed mouth. I stepped closer, my boots sinking softly into untouched snow. There were no tracks. Not a single print leading up to the wall, none leaving it, as if the message had appeared out of the air itself. My pulse thudded low and deep, the kind of fear that doesn't burst, but creeps. The handwriting, there was no mistaking it. Slanted letters, hurried strokes, the looping flourish on the Y. He always wrote like he spoke, impatient with the world and himself, eager to get meaning out faster than his hand could move. I ran my fingers lightly across the chalk, and it smeared beneath my touch, damped and fresh. It had been written minutes ago, but he was gone. Grief has a way of bending time, stretching moments into memories, memories into ghosts. For weeks I had walked the farm believing the quiet belonged to sorrow alone. The kettle that never whistled anymore, the chair at the table pushed back just slightly from where it always sat, the barn door that sometimes hung ajar. I blamed myself for noticing, for imagining, for wanting so badly for him to still be here. But this was real. The cold sank into me, creeping through my coat, into my bones. I glanced around the yard, the fields beyond, faint under moonlight, the line of pines standing silent as witnesses. No movement, no sound, only the hiss of wind brushing past the barn's rooftop. I whispered into the darkness, "Who's there?" My voice was swallowed instantly, as though the night refused to let it travel. I took a step back, heart knocking against my ribs. I had swept this ground earlier. I would have seen footprints, I was sure of it. Snow had fallen lightly since, but not enough to cover anything fresh. Someone had stood inches from that wall and written his handwriting, knowing I would see it, knowing exactly what it would do to me. The words burned in my mind. Simple, but devastating. I'm still here. That was what he used to say whenever I spiraled after long days. When I feared losing him to work, to illness, to life, he would say it with a smirk, brushing my hair back, as though the statement itself could anchor me. It always had. My throat tightened painfully. I turned toward the barn door. A thin seam of darkness pressed outward between the boards, as though the interior held a breath. The iron latch gleamed faintly, closed, locked. I knew it was locked. I had checked it myself before sweeping. Yet suddenly, I felt certain something waited inside. The lantern light flickered again, casting long, spidery shadows across the snow. The barn's roof creaked softly, like an old man stirring in sleep. I wrapped my fingers around the latch, the metal biting cold into my palm. "Don't," a voice inside me whispered, the voice that remembered finding his body just months before, the stillness of him, the helplessness. But grief does strange things to courage. I lifted the latch. The door groaned open an inch, releasing a draft of air that smelled faintly of hay, dust, and something unfamiliar. Smoke? No. Chalk. Fresh chalk. I swallowed hard and pushed the door wider, lantern raised. The barn interior spilled into view slowly, shapes emerging from darkness. The old workbench, the pile of tools, the ladder leaning where he had left it, the beams above catching stray dust like stars. Nothing moved. The hayloft above hung silent. I stepped inside, the wooden floor sighing under my weight. Every sound felt magnified, each breath echoing. I turned toward the wall where he used to mark measurements for projects. Tiny dates and numbers etched into wood. Something new was there. Another message. Smaller this time, but unmistakable. Look up. A tremor ran through me. I lifted the lantern toward the rafters. At first, only dust glimmered in the beam. Then, slowly, something took shape. Thin white lines on the underside of a beam, hidden unless lit directly. Chalk drawings. A symbol, a circle, intersected by 3 lines. He had drawn it once before, months before he died, when he was working late nights and growing distant. I had asked what it meant, and he had only smiled, eyes tired, and said, "Something I'll explain when it's time." The lantern flickered hard, nearly going out. The barn creaked sharply, wood snapping in protest, as though something shifted above. I stumbled back, breath caught in my throat, scanning the beams. Nothing, only darkness thickening. I backed toward the doorway, the cold night air brushing my neck like a warning. Once outside, I slammed the door shut and dropped the latch with shaking hands. I stood staring at the barn, the message behind me glowing faintly in lantern light. The snow still undisturbed. No footprints. No explanation. Only the chilling realization that someone had walked into my grief, into the one place I still felt him, and left messages in his hand. Someone who knew him. Someone who wanted me to believe, or wanted me to break. The wind picked up again, sweeping across the yard, scattering loose snow and soft spirals. The lantern flame steadied, settling into a quiet glow. I looked back at the words on the barn, their brightness already fading as frost crept over them. My heart beat slower now, heavy and deliberate. Whoever wrote them had been close enough to touch me, close enough to watch. I wrapped my coat tighter and stepped backward toward the house, never turning my back fully to the barn. Every instinct screamed that I was no longer grieving alone. Something else was here, something patient, something that knew exactly where to find me. As I reached the porch, the house lights flickered once, then went dark, and in that sudden blackness, I realized this intrusion wasn't about comfort or cruelty. It was an invitation, or a warning. The line between the two had never felt so thin. The ladder groaned beneath my weight, each rung announcing my presence in the quiet barn like a warning I couldn't take back. The lantern in my hand swung gently, casting trembling circles of light up the wooden walls and into the dark above. Dust drifted through the beam like slow-moving snow, sparkling and disappearing again as the lantern swayed. Halfway up, I paused, listening, truly listening to the silence pressing down from the hayloft. It wasn't the peaceful silence of an empty space. It felt held, contained, as though someone had taken a breath and never let it go. My fingers tightened on the rung. I kept climbing. When my head finally rose above the loft floor, the breath I'd been holding slipped out in a shaky cloud. The hay I expected, the clutter of old tools, forgotten boxes, was gone. The space was swept clean, the boards bare, except for a single army blanket folded neatly in the far corner. The lantern's light washed over it, revealing edges sharp and precise, the kind of careful fold that comes from practiced hands. I stepped onto the loft, my boots landing with soft thuds that echoed more than they should have. The air felt warmer up there, close and stale, holding scents trapped beneath the rafters. I lifted the lantern higher, the flames stretching shadows like long fingers across the floor. That's when I saw it. Resting on top of the blanket, Worn smooth from years of use, was his old slingshot. My knees nearly buckled. I hadn't seen that slingshot in decades. He had carved it himself from a branch of the crabapple tree near the creek, sanding it with the care only a boy determined to prove something to the world could have. It had disappeared the summer after the fire, the summer we burned the last of his childhood things in a desperate attempt to move forward, or so I believed. I walked toward it slowly, as though it might vanish if I moved too fast. The boards creaked beneath me, familiar yet unfamiliar, carrying memories I had tried to bury. When I reached the blanket, the lantern's flames steadied, brightening the slingshot's contours, the smooth wood, the frayed leather, the tiny nick near the handle when he had dropped it on the river rocks. I reached out, fingers brushing the surface. Warm. Not the lingering warmth of wood holding daylight, fresh warmth, as if it had been held recently, maybe moments before I climbed the ladder. My throat tightened. Then the smell hit me. Faint, but undeniable. Tobacco. Not just any tobacco. The brand he used to steal from his father, stuffing the pouches into his socks before sneaking out to the barn, thinking I didn't know. He always smelled like that one summer. Smoke, sweat, river water, and sunshine. Reckless boyhood pressed into scent. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could hear him laughing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But grief doesn't care about logic. It stitches sound into silence, memory into emptiness, until you can almost believe. Almost. I sank down onto the floor, lantern beside me. The wood cold through my jeans. The blanket was folded too neatly for someone passing through, too lovingly, carefully, as if whoever placed it wanted me to notice, wanted me to sit precisely where I was now. I stared at the slingshot, heart thudding slow and heavy, like footsteps approaching in snow. No footprints outside. No disturbed dust on the ladder. None of this made sense, unless the person who left it was still here.
Watching. The thought crawled along my spine, chilling every inch of skin. I held my breath, listening to the barn around me. The rafters shifted softly. Wood settled. A mouse scrabbled far below. Then silence again. Dense. Waiting. I pulled my coat closer, trying to steady my breathing. The lantern flame fluttered once, as though brushed by movement. I whispered, barely audible, "Why are you doing this?" My voice felt too loud. Even though it was barely a breath, shadows shifted in the corner. Not from movement, but from the lantern's trembling. Still, my body reacted, muscles tightening, instinct screaming that I was not alone. I scanned the loft, eyes adjusting to darkness beyond the lantern's reach. The corners seemed deeper than they should be, like the dark had weight. I reached for the slingshot again, lifting it carefully. The leather band stretched slightly under my thumb, flexible, not brittle with age. Someone had maintained it, someone who remembered, someone who cared enough to preserve it, or someone who wanted me to believe they did. That possibility twisted something in my chest. I looked toward the rafters, the beams overhead forming a cage of shadows. When I exhaled, my breath drifted upward, fading into darkness. A soft sound answered, a shift, not loud, not close, just enough. I froze, heart stopping mid-beat, ears straining. Nothing, but the certainty rooted itself deep. I was being watched. Whoever left this, whoever knew these details of his life was not trying to comfort me. They were reaching into the most vulnerable part of me, pulling threads they knew would unravel everything I had tried to hold together since he died. I placed the slingshot gently back onto the blanket, hands trembling. The tobacco scent lingered thickly now, as if the air itself remembered fingers rolling cigarettes, lips curling mischievously as smoke curled toward the rafters. I stood slowly, forcing myself not to rush. Panic would make noise. Noise would reveal fear. I did not want whoever might be listening to hear how afraid I was. I stepped backwards, careful, lantern held steady, eyes never leaving the dark. The loft floor creaked once beneath my heel. The sound that followed was not mine. A soft rasp above. A breath? A whisper of cloth? I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming to run, to flee down the ladder and bolt the barn doors behind me. But I moved with measured steps, refusing to turn my back until I reached the ladder. Only then did I lower myself, one rung at a time, lantern shaking now despite my efforts. When my boots touched the ground, I almost collapsed with relief, but I forced myself upright, glancing once more toward the loft. The darkness stared back, silent, patient, as though it knew something I didn't. I backed toward the barn door, never breaking eye contact with the loft's opening. Only when the cold night air hit my face did I let out the breath I had been holding. The door thudded shut. I dropped the latch into place with trembling fingers. The wind whispered across the yard, carrying snow in soft spirals, erasing the stillness. But nothing could erase the truth settling in my bones. Someone had been inside my grief long before tonight, and they weren't finished. The house felt colder than the barn, not in temperature, but in weight. The moment I stepped through the kitchen door, the air pressed against my ribs, thick and stale, like the walls had been holding their breath the entire time I was gone. Snow still clung to my boots, melting into dark puddles on the wood floor, but I barely noticed. My hands were shaking too badly to remove my coat, the lantern's fading light swinging in my grip. I closed the door quietly, though there was no reason to be quiet. No one living waited for me here. Still, something in me feared making noise, feared drawing attention, as if sound itself might summon whatever presence had been in the barn. The house watched me. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing softly, as though the floor remembered heavier footsteps beside mine, his footsteps. I paused halfway, eyes drawn to the framed photograph on the wall, him in uniform, grin too big for his face, eyes bright with reckless hope. I reached out and touched the glass, fingertips cold against his smile. A memory flickered, his hand on the small of my back before he shipped out, his voice low, promising letters, promising returns, promising a future. Promises the War Department told me he never had the chance to keep. My throat tightened. I turned away quickly, moving toward the bedroom. My fingers fumbled with the closet door, wood rasping softly as it opened. On the top shelf, just as I had left it years ago, sat the shoebox. Brown, edges frayed, lid slightly bowed from time, unopened letters. Dozens of them. Every envelope stamped with the sharp black seal of the War Department. The official tone of death pressed into paper. Missing in action. Presumed killed. Regret to inform. Each one felt like another shovel of dirt thrown onto my life. I dragged a chair closer, climbing carefully. The box felt heavier than I remembered, as if grief had soaked into the cardboard, saturating it. Dust puffed into the air as I lifted it down, settling into my throat. I carried it to the kitchen table, setting the lantern beside it. The flame flickered, shadows jumping across the walls, making the room feel too large and too small at the same time. I sat. For a moment, I just stared. I had never opened them, not one. I had told myself I was protecting my heart, that reading them would only sharpen the pain. But the truth was simpler, uglier. I was afraid that opening them would make his death real.
The smell inside was faint, paper, ink, a whisper of old starch. I sifted through the envelopes, each one a small tomb of words I had never allowed myself to. My breath caught when I reached one near the bottom. The envelope was wrong, slit open, not sealed like the rest. My name, printed in neat military type, had been crossed out with a single line. Beneath it, in handwriting I would know anywhere, sharp, impatient, looping the Y. Deliver to mother when she's ready. My heart stopped, then resumed too fast, hammering against my ribs. I ran my thumb over the handwriting, the ink slightly smeared as though someone had written it in haste, or with trembling hands. My own hands shook violently as I lifted the letter from the envelope. The paper was thin, creased, edges worn. My vision blurred for a moment, tears rising without permission. The date hit me first. 3 weeks after the telegram. 3 weeks after they told me he died. 3 weeks after they lowered a flag and handed me folded fabric as though it could replace a heartbeat. My breath fractured. This letter should not exist. My fingers tore the paper slightly as I unfolded it, the fibers giving way under the tremor. I forced my eyes to steady, lantern light wobbling across the page, his handwriting. Not typed, not dictated, his. The first line stole every breath left in me. I'm alive. My hand flew to my mouth. The room tilted. Snow slid from the roof outside with a soft thud, but it sounded distant, muted by the roaring in my ears. I read the words again, needing to see them, needing them to be real. I'm alive. My pulse pounded so hard I could barely hear myself think. I continued, eyes racing across the page. They told you I died. They had to. There are things I've seen they can't let out. My stomach twisted. He wrote about being moved to a different location, unnamed, guarded, isolated, men disappearing in the night. Experiments, he hinted. No details, only shadows. They don't want anyone to know what we became witness to. I blinked hard, breath shallow. Witness to what? He wrote about escape, about fear, about trying to get word to me quietly. They watch everything we send. My hands tightened around the paper, crinkling it. Then another line, written darker, pressure heavy. If you get this, it means I didn't make it out. My vision wavered. The lantern flame fluttered violently as though reacting to the words. He continued, but they will come to you. They can't risk anyone knowing I survived. Cold shot through me, deeper than any winter wind. A soft creak sounded from the hallway. I froze. Letter clutched in my hands. The house was still, too still. I forced myself to breathe silently. I returned my eyes to the page. Trust no one wearing a uniform, not even if they say they're here to help. A tear slipped down my cheek. I whispered, "Why didn't you send this sooner?" My voice shook. The final lines were the worst. The army lied because it was easier to bury us than admit what happened. If they told the truth, everything would change. I'm sorry. A blot of ink stained the page, as though the pen had paused too long. Underneath one final sentence, "You're not safe." My blood turned to ice. The lantern dimmed suddenly, flame shrinking, shadows expanding. The kitchen darkened around me. I set the letter down with trembling hands, trying to steady myself. Another sound, this time closer. The floorboard near the hallway, the familiar creak of weight shifting. My breath stopped. I turned my head slowly toward the doorway. Nothing, just darkness thick enough to swallow light, but I knew that sound. It was the sound of someone moving inside the house, someone who knew exactly where to step to avoid noise, almost. Someone who might have been here before, watching. The letter trembled before me. Why would the army lie? The answer settled like a stone in my chest. Because the truth was still alive, somewhere, or worse, standing in my hallway. The lantern flickered again, nearly dying. I swallowed hard, fingers closing around the letter as though it could protect me. The house held its breath. So did I. The house was darker than usual that night, not just because the lantern had burned low, but because the shadows felt heavier, as though they had gathered in the corners while I read that letter, waiting for their moment. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling between my fingers when the floorboards gave a soft groan without warning. For a heartbeat, I thought it was just the house settling under the weight of winter. Then I heard it, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, boots. The kind soldiers wore. My breath caught, frozen in my throat. The lantern flickered once, twice, then steadied, casting pale gold across the walls. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The steps paused just outside the door, boards creaking beneath a heavy weight. The silence that followed felt alive, listening, waiting for me to react. I slid my chair back as quietly as I could, the wood whispering against the floor. My heartbeat thudded inside my ears, louder than any wind outside. I reached up and pinched the edge of the curtain between two fingers, lifting it just enough to see. Only shadow. A tall shape, more suggestion than form, stood at the edge of the porch light. Still, patient, as though it knew I was watching. Then came the sound. Not knocking, not footsteps. A soft scrape, chalk, against wood. My stomach dropped. The same sound I'd heard in the barn. The clock read 2:04 a.m. The house smelled faintly of smoke and old paper, the last remnants of warmth slipping away. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold in the rising panic. Whoever was out there was close enough to touch the door, close enough to write, close enough to know I was awake. The scraping stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I waited, counting my breaths, forcing them to stay quiet. When I finally reached for the doorknob, my hand shook so violently I had to steady it against the frame. I turned it slowly, bracing myself for resistance. The door swung open without a sound. Cold air rushed in, biting my skin, filling my lungs with frost. Snow had begun to fall, tiny flakes drifting lazily as though the sky was too tired to commit to a storm. The porch was empty, no footprints on the steps, no shadow lingering near the trees, just stillness. My eyes traveled toward the barn, barely visible in the dim light. Something white glowed faintly on the wood, catching the lantern's reflection. Writing, fresh, large. My feet carried me forward before my mind caught up. Snow muffled my steps, hiding the sound. The wind held its breath. I reached the barn wall, heart pounding so hard I thought it might leave my body. The words stared back at me. Don't tell them yet. My mouth went dry. The chalk lines were crisp, damp, glistening slightly where snowflakes touched them. I lifted my fingers to the letters. The chalk smudged under my touch, leaving powder on my skin. Whoever wrote this had just been here, seconds ago. I spun around, lantern held out like a shield. The yard stretched quiet and empty, snow softening every surface, erasing the world one flake at a time. No footprints led toward the woods, none approached from the road, just untouched white, smooth as linen, as if no one had ever been there at all. I backed toward the barn door, pulse racing, lantern trembling. The letter in my pocket felt suddenly heavier, as though it were made of iron instead of paper. I imagined him writing in some hidden place, hands shaking, knowing someone might intercept his words. Don't tell them yet. Them. Who was them? The army? The government? The people who watched the barn? The ones who crept around my house at night? Or was it meant for me? Was he telling me not to reveal something? Not to speak? Not to trust? The thought twisted inside me, cold and sharp. The wind picked up, scattering snow across the message. The first letters began to blur, white flakes clinging to the rough wood. I watched helplessly as the words faded, swallowed by winter's quiet hunger. Soon there would be no proof anyone had been here. No sign of chalk, no footprints, no presence, just silence. I stepped backward, breath shaking, then turned and hurried toward the porch, nearly tripping in the drifting snow. My fingers were numb by the time I reached the door. I closed it quickly and slid the bolt, though I wasn't sure a piece of metal could protect me from whatever had written that message. I leaned my back against the door, breathing hard. The house creaked softly, settling into the storm's rhythm. The lantern flame quivered, casting long shadows across the walls. Something inside me shifted. Fear, yes, but something else. A strange, fragile hope. Someone had been here. Someone who knew the truth. Someone who might have been protecting me, or warning me. I carried the lantern back to the kitchen and set it on the table beside the torn letter. The words blurred through my tears. My eyes drifted to the envelope again. The line written in his hand. Deliver to mother when she's ready. Ready for what? The truth? Danger? Him? I pressed the letter to my chest and sank into the chair. Snow tapped softly against the windows, gentle as breathing. The storm grew thicker, erasing everything beyond the glass. Time stretched. Minutes crawled. I kept the lantern lit until morning, afraid that if the light died, the shadows would move again. Sometimes, in the quiet between gusts of wind, I thought I heard footsteps circling the house. A soft crunch, then silence. Maybe imagination, maybe memory, or maybe not. The letter trembled slightly with each heartbeat. My fingers traced the words again and again, desperate for meaning. Don't tell them, yet. Who was protecting whom? Was someone shielding me from danger? Or was someone keeping me from exposing the truth? As the sky lightened with the first gray suggestion of dawn, the lantern finally flickered low. I rose slowly and walked to the window. The barn stood still and silent, its surface scrubbed clean by snow. No writing, no trace, just blank wood and drifting white. But I knew what I had seen. I knew someone had been on my porch, had written those words for me, had watched my house in the freezing dark. Whether they were friend or enemy, I still didn't know. I wrapped my arms around myself, the cold seeping through my bones. Morning had come, but the darkness inside the house remained. And for the first time since the telegram arrived, a terrifying possibility settled over me. Maybe the dead weren't the only ones who had lied. Maybe someone else was alive, watching, waiting. Deciding when I was ready. The church bells sounded softer than usual that morning, as though the air itself was tired. The sunlight coming through the stained glass windows looked weak, washed pale by winter. I took my usual seat, third row from the back, aisle side, where I could slip out unnoticed if the hymns grew too heavy. The wood felt cold beneath me, colder than it should have been. I folded my hands, trying to quiet my breathing, when I saw him, a man I had never seen before, thin as a fence post, skin weathered and sunburned, eyes far too old for his young face. He sat in the pew that used to belong to my boy, and he never looked away from me, not once. The choir began, voices low and trembling, but I barely heard them. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out the organ. The stranger's gaze stayed fixed on me, unblinking, like he had traveled here for this single purpose. I forced myself to look forward, but the weight of his stare pressed between my shoulder blades. Outside, a crow cawed, sharp, lonely, familiar. The hymn book slipped slightly in my hands. The stranger didn't sing, didn't bow his head, didn't pray. He just watched, as though he was waiting for something inside me to break open. The candles flickered restlessly as the service settled into its rhythm, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Pastor Reed spoke about faith, endurance, and the unseen things we carry, and each word sliced a little deeper. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard, pretending it was the draft. The stranger shifted forward, elbows on his knees, leaning closer as though he could hear my thoughts. His clothes were dusty, the knees worn thin. His boots looked like they'd walked farther than any road in our town. When the offering plate passed, he didn't reach for it. His hands stayed clasped, knuckles scarred, skin cracked like dry earth. I wondered if he was a traveler, a migrant, a drifter. But something inside me whispered otherwise. A flicker in my memory, campfire laughter, desert wind, sandstorms my boy once described in his letters. I shook the thought away. My son was gone. The telegram had said so. The War Department had confirmed it. The funeral had been real, hadn't it? My breath trembled. I kept my eyes on the hymn numbers posted by the altar, pretending I didn't feel watched, pretending I belonged to this moment and not to the terrible wondering that had haunted me for months. When the final prayer ended, the congregation rose, coats rustling, shoes scuffing against the wooden floor. I stayed seated, pretending to sort my gloves, delaying. I didn't want to pass him in the aisle. But when I finally stood, he was already there, standing in front of me, blocking the way, too close. His eyes, up close, were worse than before. They held dust storms and sleepless nights and the hollow ache of someone who'd seen things the world pretended didn't happen. He didn't speak, not at first. He just opened his hand and pressed something into my palm, warm from his skin, soft from being folded too many times. A note. Before I could breathe, he leaned in, voice low, rough like gravel. He asked me to wait until you believed. My heart stopped. The scent of desert dust clung to the paper, faint but unmistakable, like the letters my boy used to send before they stopped coming. My knees weakened, and for a moment I thought I might sink into the pew, but the stranger stepped back, tipped his head once, then walked away down the aisle, slipping through the church doors without a single person turning to notice him. It was as though he hadn't existed at all. Outside, the wind tugged at my coat as I unfolded the note with trembling fingers. The writing wasn't my son's, but it wasn't unfamiliar either. Sharp strokes, rushed and uneven, like someone writing in a moving truck or under a tent lamp. The words were simple, but they stole the warmth from my blood. He's not where they said. My breath shuddered out of me. The world tilted slightly.
The steeple above creaked, and the sky felt too wide, too bright, too cruel. I looked up and scanned the street, searching for the stranger, but he was gone, vanished into the quiet Sunday morning like a ghost. The note fluttered in my hand as though trying to escape. I clutched it tighter. My boy's pew, the chalk messages, the unopened letter dated after his death, boots on the porch, the smell of tobacco in the hayloft. All the pieces I tried to ignore pressed together, forming a shape too impossible to name, or too dangerous. I walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last. The houses along the road looked ordinary, laundry lines swaying, curtains drawn, porches swept clean. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. A child laughed in the distance. Life continued as though nothing had happened, as though my world hadn't shifted 1 inch to the left. Inside the kitchen, I set the note beside the torn letter, the chalk-mark rag, the slingshot, and the faded photograph. Evidence or delusion? I couldn't tell anymore. The clock ticked loudly, marking time I no longer trusted. He asked me to wait until you believed. Believed what? That he was alive? That he never died? That someone had taken him? Hidden him? Used him? Or worse, that he was in danger because of me. The kettle whined softly on the stove, but I didn't move to lift it. My hands rested flat against the table, steadying myself against the tremor inside. A single snowflake drifted against the window pane, melting slowly, leaving a thin trail of water that looked like a tear. I sat down. The note stared up at me. The air felt too still, too expectant, as though the house itself was listening again.
Footsteps in the barn, boots on the porch, a man in my son's pew. Someone had been following a timeline, waiting for me to reach this point, to question, to doubt, to believe. Outside, the church bell rang once, an echo carried by the wind. I lifted the note again, its edges worn, its message stark. He's not where they said. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since the telegram arrived, I whispered into the quiet kitchen, "Where is my boy?" The house didn't answer, but something in the silence felt like a door unlocking, a beginning, a warning, or a summons. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing the road, the yard, the world beyond my window. And somewhere, not too far, not too near, someone else heard the same bell. The floorboards groaned beneath my knees as I pressed my ear to the wood, listening for something I couldn't name. The lantern beside me cast long shadows across the barn, stretching like fingers toward the dark corners. A draft slipped between the boards, carrying the scent of old hay and winter air. My hand trembled as I pried up the first plank, then the second, dust rising like ghosts disturbed. Beneath them, tucked into a hollow I never knew existed, sat a rusted ammunition box, dented, scarred, and stamped with a war day I had spent years trying to forget. My breath caught, hanging in the cold air like a suspended prayer. I lifted the box slowly, afraid it might crumble into time itself, and set it gently on the floor. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling the weight of the years it had waited. Then I opened the latch. Inside lay photographs, dozens of them, some curled at the edges, some still sharp, all worn by handling I knew had not been mine. I picked up the first one, holding it by the corners like it might dissolve if I breathed. My boy, laughing, sunburned, his arm around a little Bedouin child with bright eyes and sand-covered feet. The desert sky glowed gold, and he looked alive. Not like the stiff, formal military portrait they sent with the telegram, not like the coffin that came home sealed, not like the grave I stood beside alone. I brought the picture closer, tracing his smile with my thumb. I remembered that grin, crooked, wide, always tipped more to the right. He hadn't smiled like that since he was 13, before the recruiters came to school, before the world convinced him he owed it something. My heart thudded once, hard, enough to hurt. The next photo showed him sitting on a cot, his head wrapped in a bandage, eyes swollen but open. A nurse stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Tyro Hospital, the sign behind him read. Cairo, not Normandy, not the field they claim he fell on.
My fingers tightened around the edges, paper bending slightly. My boy had lived. After. Long enough for someone to take this picture. Long enough to be kept from me. A lantern flickered outside, wind rattling the barn siding. I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see the thin stranger from church standing there again, watching, waiting. But the night stayed still, silent, but for the old wood breathing. I reached back into the box and lifted another photograph. This one stopped my breath. My son stood beside the stranger, the very same man who had pressed the note into my palm. The two of them shoulder to shoulder, dusty, exhausted, but alive. The stranger's eyes in the picture looked younger, less haunted, but unmistakable. They were somewhere in the desert, tents behind them, the sky the color of copper. My hand shook, and the lantern flame quivered with me. Why them? Why together? Why never sent? The answer pressed at the edges of my mind, but I wasn't ready to let it in. Not yet. I spread the photographs across the floor, his face in every one changing over time. Some joyful, some tired, some wary, some looking over his shoulder like someone might be following. I found one where he sat by a fire, writing in a notebook, gaze distant. The corner was torn. My chest ached at the sight. He had been alive long enough to miss home, long enough to think of me, long enough to be kept from me by someone else's hands.
I closed the box and held it in my lap, staring at the grain of the wood beneath my feet. The silence felt thick, like the barn itself was listening. Dust floated lazily in the lantern glow, settling on my hands, my sleeves, my breath. My heartbeat slowed, though the ache inside did not. He had lived, he had written, he had waited, and someone had carried pieces of him home. The question that rose inside me was small, quiet, and terrifying. When did my boy stop belonging to me? I stood slowly, cradling the box, and crossed the barn to the window. Snow drifted outside, soft and steady, covering footsteps, tire tracks, evidence. The world was erasing itself one flake at a time. I watched it fall, the cold glass fogging where my breath touched it. Somewhere out there, someone else had these memories too. Someone else had stood beside my son. Someone else had promised him something. Someone else was keeping watch. I hugged the box to my chest and whispered into the dim barn, I am ready now. The wind paused, just for a heartbeat. Then the lantern flickered, and footsteps, distant, slow, deliberate, crunched in the snow just beyond the door. Dusk settled over the farm like a slow breath, the kind that sinks into the bones before you realize you're cold. The snow had thickened since morning, layering itself across the yard in soft waves, smoothing the rough edges of fences and footprints alike. I stood at the kitchen window, lantern lit behind me, watching the barn swallow the last threads of light. The glass trembled faintly under the wind's steady push, and I pressed my fingertips to it, feeling the chill seep through. That's when I saw him, silhouette dark against the falling white, shoulders hunched, snow clinging to his coat in thick patches, the stranger from church, the man with the desert in his eyes. He walked with purpose, each step slow but unyielding, as though he had crossed much farther than the field between us. I didn't move. The world seemed to narrow to the sound of his boots crunching closer. When the knock came, it was soft, almost hesitant, like he feared the door might reject him. I opened it before he could lift his hand again. Snow spilled in around him, clinging to the threshold. His face was red from the cold, but beneath the rawness lay exhaustion, deep, carved-in fatigue. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest, eyes lowered. "I'm sorry to come again," he murmured, voice roughened by distance and weather. "But he wanted you to know." The words hit something inside me that had been held together with brittle thread. I stepped aside and he entered, moving like a man twice his age, boots leaving wet prints across the worn wood. The lantern light caught the lines around his mouth, the small ticks of grief and responsibility etched there. He didn't sit until I nodded. Even then, he perched on the edge of the chair, back straight, as though ready to stand at any moment. The silence between us stretched. I realized he was waiting, not for permission to speak, but for strength to begin. "He survived the ambush," he finally said.
eyes lifting to meet mine. Your boy. He made it out. The room swayed. The lantern flickered. For a moment, I couldn't inhale. I had imagined every possible outcome over the years. Wounded, captured, lost, but not this. Not alive, not walking and breathing in some corner of the world, while I stood here lighting candles for a grave filled with nothing. But then, he swallowed hard, voice thinning. They took him. Took? I repeated, the word foreign in my mouth. He nodded. Traffickers, the kind that move people across borders like cattle, the kind that buy and sell soldiers who survive what they shouldn't. My hands tightened around the mug I'd forgotten I was holding. The ceramic creaked under the strain. The kettle on the stove hissed softly, steam rising in thin spirals, but the room felt frozen. How did he escape? My voice cracked, surprising me. The stranger looked up again, and for the first time, something like pride lit his expression. He fought, he whispered. He never stopped fighting. He slipped away during a border transfer last year, walked through mountains with nothing but torn boots and a borrowed coat, found us again. Us. The word lodged itself in me like a splinter. You knew him that long? I asked. His answer came quietly. I was with him the night of the ambush. I was the one who pulled him out. My breath faltered. This man had carried pieces of my son I never would have seen. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small tin container, dented and scratched. He placed it on the table with reverence. He kept this, he said. It reminded him of home. Inside were fragments, sand, a button from a shirt I had mended when my boy was 16, a folded scrap of paper with my handwriting on it, grocery notes, hurriedly scribbled. My throat closed. He talked about you every night, the stranger continued. Said he could handle anything as long as he remembered who he was before the war. I closed my eyes, tears burning untouched. But when he escaped, the man said slowly, he didn't come straight back. My eyes snapped open. Why? The stranger hesitated, shoulders tightening. Snow melted in his hair, dripping on his collar. Because he thought, his voice broke, forcing him to pause. He thought you'd hate him for staying away so long, for not finding a way home sooner, for surviving when others didn't. Hate him?
The floor seemed to tilt beneath me, the world sliding sideways. I buried an empty coffin, I whispered. I mourned a ghost while he breathed somewhere alone. The stranger's eyes filled with grief of his own. He knew, he said. That's why he sent me ahead. He wanted someone to tell you gently, someone who could explain. The room went silent except for the ticking of the old clock, each second sounding like a heartbeat. The army buried a coffin to spare the town another scandal. Too many missing, too many unaccounted for. They declared them dead to keep morale high. I pressed my palm to my mouth, trying to contain the sound rising in my chest. So they lied, I whispered through my fingers. They erased him, the stranger corrected. On paper, he never returned. No uniform, no record. He leaned forward, eyes fierce now. He was coming here, to you. No medals, no parade, just home. The image of him walking through the snow toward the porch rose in my mind, coat thin, boots worn, breath fogging the night air. The thought nearly shattered me. What happened? I forced out. The stranger looked down at his hands. He disappeared again. 2 months ago. His voice trembled. He told me if anything happened to him, I had to make sure you knew the truth. Snow tapped softly against the window, like fingers asking to be let in. I stood slowly, knees weak, and walked to the window. The yard lay quiet, barn half buried in white. Somewhere out there, messages written in chalk still clung to wood. Don't tell him yet. Protecting me, protecting himself, or both. Behind me, the stranger spoke again, voice barely audible. He loved you more than anything. He wasn't sure you'd believe he came back, that you'd forgive him for surviving wrong. I turned, tears blurring the lantern light. How long have you carried my son's ghost? I asked. He lifted his eyes, haunted and earnest. Since the desert, he said, since he saved my life. The clock chimed the hour low and somber. The stranger stood, pulling his hat back on. "I'll return," he murmured, "when you're ready." He moved toward the door, snow drifting in when he opened it. He paused on the threshold. "He was close," he whispered, "closer than you think." Then he stepped into the dusk, swallowed by falling white. I pressed my hand against the window as his shape disappeared. The world felt suddenly larger and far more dangerous. Somewhere in that snowy silence, my son lived or died again, and now I knew the truth. The next knock might not be a stranger's. It might be his. The snow melted slowly that week, shrinking back into the earth like a secret deciding whether to stay buried. Each morning, I stepped onto the porch and watched the yard reappear in patches: brown grass, stubborn tufts of hay, the muddy ruts of wagon wheels long gone. The barn roof dripped steadily, the sound soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat calming itself after panic. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and damp wood. 3 more weeks had passed, and still we waited for news, for a sign, for footsteps that might never come. The house felt too quiet, as though it were holding its breath with me. We burned letters in the stove, pages curling into black lace before crumbling to ash. Every envelope with military ink, every official stamp, gone. The stranger said they were dangerous to keep, that someone might come looking. I didn't argue. Firelight flickered against his gaunt face, sharpening the hollows beneath his cheekbones. He watched each flame devour another fragment of truth, his jaw clenched tight. "We speak of nothing," he whispered one night, voice barely audible over the crackle. I nodded, though my hands shook as I fed another letter into the fire. The house listened. Walls soaked in grief were now steeped in fear. We learned to speak in whispers, leaning close, breath warm against chilled skin. At night, when the wind rattled the windows, we switched to gestures: small taps on the table, a raised eyebrow, a finger pointed toward the barn. Silence became our language, heavy but necessary. He slept in the hayloft, thin frame curled under my son's old army blanket. The first time I saw him settled there, I had to step outside to steady myself. That blanket had covered my boy through thunderstorms and fevers, wrapped him after adventures in the woods, warmed him after cold mornings of chores. Now it covered a stranger who carried my son's ghost. Sometimes in the early hours, I heard him crying quietly, the kind of crying that comes from deep wounds, not recent ones. I pretended not to hear. Some grief belongs to the person holding it. Every night I left the barn door unlatched and a candle burning inside, its flame small and steady. The stranger said it was foolish, that anyone could wander in, but I did it anyway. If my boy was still out there, cold, frightened, unsure, I wanted him to see the light. I wanted him to know he had a place to walk toward. Each night I stood at the back window watching the barn glow faintly like a beacon against the dark. My breath fogged the glass and I traced circles absently with my fingertip, the way I used to when waiting for him to return from town. "He'll come," I whispered once, not realizing I'd spoken out loud. The stranger, sitting at the kitchen table, looked up with tired eyes. "He wants to," he murmured. "That's why hurting's so hard."
On the first night without snow, the wind died completely. The silence outside pressed against the windows, thick and expectant. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar stillness. Then, somewhere far down the lane, gravel shifted. A single crunch. My body went rigid. Another crunch. Slow, measured steps, deliberate and steady. The rhythm struck something deep inside me, something older than fear, older than grief. It was a sound I had known since my boy was young, the way he walked when he didn't want to wake me after coming home late. Heel, toe, pause. Heel, toe, pause. A careful gait, respectful, guilty, familiar. My heart began to pound, not fast, but heavy, like a drum announcing something inevitable. I threw back the covers and slipped on my boots with trembling hands. The stranger was already at the loft door, eyes wide, listening. He lifted one finger, signaling stillness. The footsteps grew closer, gravel grinding beneath weight, not hurried, not uncertain, coming home. I moved to the back door, lantern shaking slightly in my grip. The stranger joined me, silent, muscles taut. For a moment we stood side by side, sharing the same breath, the same impossible thought. What if it wasn't him? What if danger walked toward us instead? But my heart knew. Some rhythms are carved into bone. I opened the door. Cold air swept in, sharp and metallic with melting ice. The yard lay pale under the moon, mud glistening where snow had surrendered. And there, emerging from the shadows of the lane, was a figure. Tall, thin, shoulders broader than I remembered, but sloped with exhaustion. Coat torn at the hem, boots worn smooth. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, just as he had after breaking it jumping from the hayloft at 17. My breath caught. He paused at the gate, hand resting on the wood as though grounding himself. The moonlight brushed across his face, revealing stubble, sunken cheeks, eyes that had seen too much, but eyes I knew better than my own reflection. My son, alive. I stepped forward without thinking, boots sinking into thawed earth. He lifted his head fully then, meeting my gaze. Something like fear flickered across his expression. Not fear of me, but fear of what he was to me now. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The stranger behind me exhaled shakily, a sound of disbelief and relief tangled together. My boy took one more step, then another, until he stood only a few feet away. His hands trembled at his sides. "Ma," he whispered. The word nearly dropped me to my knees. His voice was deeper, rougher, frayed at the edges from years of silence or shouting or both, but it was his. "Why didn't you come home sooner?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. Not accusation, not anger, just the ache of a mother who had waited too long. He swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "I needed to be someone you could look at, not someone you'd mourn again." Between us, the candlelight from the barn flickered, casting warm gold across the mud, the blanket in the loft, the chalk on the wood, the burned letters. All the fragments of waiting converged in that moment. I reached out, fingers trembling. He hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then his hand closed around mine. Warm, solid, real. The stranger turned away, giving us the privacy of his bowed head. Somewhere down the road, an engine growled faintly. Headlights flickered through trees. Not everyone would be glad he returned. The grip on my hand tightened. "Don't have long," he whispered. Moonlight glinted on something metallic at his belt. A knife, small but worn. Fear prickled along my spine. But not for myself, for him. For what followed him here. He looked toward the barn, toward the light I had left burning every night. "You waited," he said, voice breaking. "I never stopped," I replied. The engine grew louder. The night held its breath, and I realized coming home might have been the most dangerous choice he could make. The moon hung low over the yard, a pale coin pressed into a sky washed clean by melting snow. The last patches of white clung stubbornly to the shadowed corners of the barn, but the earth beneath my boots was soft, thawed, smelling of mud and old hay. Lantern light flickered in my shaking hand, casting long, wavering shadows across the fence posts. For a breath, I wondered if the night itself was playing tricks on me, if exhaustion and longing had finally woven a dream vivid enough to step into. Then he moved. Just a shift of weight, a tilt of the head, but it was enough to shatter the line between memory and reality. He stood in the moonlight, thinner than he had ever been, jacket hanging off sharp shoulders, the collar frayed and patched. Scars traced pale lines across his cheeks and jaw, disappearing into the rough stubble. But it was his eyes that broke me, eyes that carried deserts and prisons, dust storms and cramped cells, places I would never walk, pain I would never fully understand. Yet beneath all that distance, I saw it. The boy who used to run barefoot across this yard, chasing fireflies with a jar cupped to his chest. He dropped his pack with a soft thud, the sound muffled by damp earth. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to stand, how to breathe. Then his lips parted, and in a voice roughened by years I couldn't name, he breathed one word. "Mama."
Not ma, not mother. Ma, the way he had whispered it at 7 years old when nightmares clawed him awake. when lightning cracked over the house and he'd run down the hallway to climb into my bed, small hands gripping my nightgown like a lifeline. The word hit me harder than any telegram ever could. My knees nearly buckled. I moved forward slowly, as though sudden motion might scatter him like frost. Lantern light flared across his face, catching the hollow under his cheekbone, the split in his lower lip, the rawness around his eyes. He didn't step back. He simply watched me, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, as if he feared I might vanish before he could reach out. I lifted my hand, fingers trembling. When my palm touched his cheek, warmth met skin, real, solid, living, not frost, not ghost, not wish. A sob escaped me before I could swallow it. His eyes fluttered shut, leaning into my touch the way he used to lean into my kiss before heading to school. "I'm here," he whispered, but the words trembled, as though he still wasn't certain he deserved to be. Behind him, the barn wall glowed faintly in the moonlight. Chalk letters, written in hurried strokes, stood out stark and white. "I'm still here." The message he had left me in the dark, damp chalk still fresh that first night. Proof that someone had walked through snow without leaving a trace. Proof that grief had not been sealed under a military headstone. My breath caught again. "You wrote that?" I murmured. He nodded once, gaze flickering toward the barn, something like shame crossing his features. "I tried to tell you, but I didn't know how. Not yet." His voice cracked on the last word. The stranger stepped out from the shadows near the porch, his presence silent but steady. My boy turned his head toward him, and in that moment I saw the bond between them, built not on friendship, but on survival, shared hunger, shared chains, shared escape. He looked back at me, eyes glossy. "I didn't want you to think I was dead, but I couldn't come home like that." He gestured vaguely toward himself, the scars, the thinness, the haunted look settling deep in his bones. "Oh, my sweet boy."
The candle in the barn guttered out sometime before dawn, leaving only the faint smell of wax and smoke drifting through the cracks in the boards. Frost clung to the edges of the windows, delicate and temporary, like breath caught in place. I sat in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, listening to the quiet groaning of the house settling into another day. The floorboards creaked overhead where the stranger slept, curled beneath my boy's old army blanket. For the first time in years, I did not dread the sunrise. Then the dogs began barking. Not the restless, half-hearted warning they gave to deer or passing trucks, but a sharp, frantic sound that tore through the morning stillness. Gravel crunched in the lane, heavy tires grinding through thawing ruts. The sound of engines, more than one, rose over the hill, followed by car doors slamming, voices carrying across the yard. Someone shouted my name. I set the mug down slowly. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The world outside had found us. When I opened the front door, cold air slapped my face, sharp enough to sting. 6 vehicles crowded the drive, sheriff's cruiser, 2 trucks, a government sedan with unfamiliar plates, and a pair of dusty station wagons filled with curious eyes. Half the town stood behind the sheriff like a congregation waiting for scripture, hats pulled low, scarves wrapped tight, breath puffing in white bursts. Sheriff Danner stepped forward, boots sinking into the thawing ground. He was a broad-shouldered man with wind-burned cheeks and eyes that never learned how to look gentle. "Martha," he called, voice carrying with practiced authority. "We've had reports." Reports. That word hung in the air like smoke. Behind him, someone murmured, "Saw him on County Road 9, looked just like..." Another voice hissed, "Ghost, I swear it." Rumors, fear, superstition, all more dangerous than bullets when people wanted a story to make sense. The sheriff cleared his throat. "We need confirmation." His gaze sharpened. "If there's a deserter on your property, you are legally required to surrender him." Deserter. The word hit like a blow.
My fingers tightened around the papers pressed against my ribs, the photographs, edges worn from years of hiding, and the unopened death telegram I had kept in a shoebox like a gravestone. Behind the sheriff, men shifted nervously. Some looked curious, some looked hungry. A few looked relieved, as though grief suddenly had a direction to point itself. Someone called out, "Bring him out! We all buried him once already!" Another voice added, "If the army wants him, they'll take him." The stranger stepped quietly onto the porch behind me, not close enough to be seen, but close enough that I could feel his tension like a coiled wire. Up in the loft, a floorboard creaked, the sound of a man holding his breath. My son, alive, home, and already threatened. The sheriff stepped forward. He said, "We need proof of identity. Papers, discharge records, anything." His tone sharpened. "Otherwise, we have authority to remove him for questioning." The crowd murmured approval, a rustling wave of voices. I felt something inside me shift, something old and heavy, something that had been lying under years of grief like a stone at the bottom of a river. Anger. Steady, quiet, bone deep. I reached into my coat and pulled out the photographs, fanned them like playing cards. The sheriff frowned as I held the first one out. A picture of my son laughing with a group of Bedouin children, sunlight catching the dust in the air. "This," I said calmly, "is my boy." Another photograph, him in a Cairo hospital bed, bandaged but smiling through exhaustion. The stranger beside him, younger, less worn. "And this," I continued, voice steady, "was taken 3 weeks after the army told me he died." Gasps rippled through the crowd. I held up the unopened telegram, the paper yellowed with age, the War Department seal still unbroken. "This is the notice you all gathered around to mourn. This is the coffin you lowered into the ground." My voice did not shake. "Empty." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That doesn't change the law," he replied. "If he deserted, he'll be taken." I felt heat flare behind my ribs, but my voice remained quiet. The war took enough. It took his childhood, his peace. It nearly took his life. My fingers curled protectively around the papers. "And now you want to take him again?" Silence spread through the yard, heavy and cold. The sheriff opened his mouth, but I stepped forward, cutting him off with a look I didn't know I could still give. "You buried him once," I said, voice low. "You stood in the rain and called him a hero. You held my shoulders while I cried." I lifted the telegram. "You let the army lie to all of us." The stranger on the porch shifted, boots scraping softly. I could feel the town's eyes flick toward the sound, suspicion sharpening like knives. I straightened, breath steady for the first time in years. "If they want to take him," I said, "they'll have to dig up that grave and bury him twice." A murmur swept through the crowd, some shocked, some moved, some suddenly uncertain. The sheriff stared at me, searching for weakness. He didn't find any. Behind him, clouds rolled across the pale morning sky, snowflakes drifting lazily. Children clung to their mothers, whispering. Old men removed their hats. Even the wind seemed to pause. The sheriff finally spoke, voice quieter. "People saw someone walking that road," he said. "If it wasn't him, who was it?" Before I could answer, the stranger stepped forward into view. His coat was dusted white, his face hollow but resolute. "It was me," he said. Gasps. "I walked the road. I came here. Not him." The sheriff blinked, thrown off balance. "Why?"
The stranger looked at me, then back at the crowd. "Because he asked me to," he said simply. "Because he trusted her." The weight of those words settled like snow on branches. The sheriff hesitated. Then someone in the crowd muttered, "Leave them be." Another voice, older, weary, "Haven't we buried enough sons?" The sheriff exhaled, long and slow. He stepped back. "Keep him inside," he said gruffly, "for now." It wasn't permission, but it wasn't arrest. He turned, signaling his men, and slowly the vehicles began to pull away, tires grinding through melting snow. Neighbors lingered a moment longer, staring, whispering, unsure whether to fear or admire.
Finally, the yard emptied. The world fell quiet again. I stood in the porch watching the last truck disappear over the hill. My son remained hidden in the barn, unseen, but listening. The stranger let out a slow breath beside me. "You bought us time," he murmured. I looked down at the photographs in my hands, the proof of life delivered too late, and felt something fierce settle in my chest. Time was all we needed. I raised my eyes to the barn wall, where the faint chalk letters still clung to the boards. "I'm still here." Snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, erasing footprints, covering the past in white. The sheriff's words lingered like smoke. Keep him inside. But my son had already come home. The snow melted almost overnight. One morning the yard was white and brittle, frozen in grief, and the next the ground showed muddy patches, soft and dark, like the earth was waking up from a long sleep. The barn roof dripped steadily, each drop landing on the wooden ramp with a hollow rhythm, the kind that settles into your bones if you stand still long enough. I watched from the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a warm mug this time, not for comfort, but simply because it felt good to hold something alive with heat. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like it was waiting for bad news. It simply breathed. The sheriff didn't come back. No letters arrived, no calls, no government cars idling at the end of the lane. The neighbors whispered, of course, they always would, but the fear in their eyes softened into curiosity, then into something like reluctant acceptance. The charges, the threats, the rumors, they vanished. Not slowly, not with explanations, but the way snow disappears in April, quietly, without apology, leaving behind only the memory of its weight. My son didn't ask how. He didn't ask why. Some things I think he already knew better than I did. The first time he stepped into the barn in daylight, he paused at the threshold, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the boards like he expected shadows to reach for him. The stranger, who still slept in the loft some nights, stood beside him, saying nothing. My boy walked to the wall where the chalk message had been written, where I had stared and wept and doubted my own sanity. His fingers brushed the boards gently, the way someone touches a scar that still aches in bad weather. Then he turned to me. "Can I fix it?" he asked. Just that. No apology, no explanation, no promises. I nodded. He picked up a paintbrush. For 3 days he worked,